Hi, I'm Lili. Today I'm going to show you how I made the whole steampunk set and props from scratch. I've used this set for my last stop motion animation. If you haven't seen the video, you can click in the link above or in the description below. This miniature set is actually a book that opened up to reveal the workshop inside of it. It took me roughly 100 hours to make the whole thing from scratch. So today I'm going to start by showing you how I made the main structure in wood. Then how I made the bricks and cobbles. Then I'm going to show you how I made the workbench, chest of drawers, tiny little tools, benzo, wood burner, and little lantern. And finally, I'm going to show you how I made the book cover. In this tutorial, I'm not going to include the steampunk airship that feature in the stop motion, because it's already got a tutorial on its own. So if you're interested in knowing how to make this one from scratch, look in the description below. First, I started to cut some 18mm plywood for the base and for the book itself. Then I've used some studs to place underneath my base, and I drill into it to connect those two. I've also used a countersink drill bit to make sure the screw will sit flush. Then I screw everything together. As you can notice, there is a gap at the back of the base, and that will come really handy later on to access the screw underneath the puppets. Then I've cut down some piano edges. Then I start to assemble the 3 plywood parts for my book with the piano hinges in between. I've cut out a piece in the middle section because I knew I had a burner coming in, and this is how it looks. The backboard is slightly taller than the middle and front board. We're talking about 5mm gap. That allow me to have a bit of space underneath so I can open and close without it catching on the texture that's going to come next. To make it stable, I've added a batten at the back of it, and then I was able to drill through to attach the book. The fact that I only had 3 screws to remove when I want to take out the book or put it back in is much easier than if I have to go underneath the whole base to access the screws. And this is how it looks when it's all assembled. Now let's move to the bricks. I've used some 5mm EVA foam and mark a line every 1 centimeter horizontally, and I've done the same vertically. Then I've used a wood burner to first mark every horizontal line. Make sure you do it outside or in a well ventilated place with gloves and a mask. Then I start to create some texture on the bricks instead of having them flat. So I've run the wood burner throughout, and I've also digged some deeper dent into it to create more of a distress effect. I've applied some white gesso throughout to prime it. Then I start to paint, first with 2 thick layers of acrylic paint. I've applied probably 10 different colors and shades until I was happy with how it looks. And then I've applied a diluted brownish gray throughout and remove the excess with a white paper towel to create the grout. Then I've dry brush with some orange for the highlight, and finally seal it with a clear matte varnish. Now to glue it to the board, I've used some contact cement. This was an old tin, so it was even more chewing gum than usual. Let it set for 10 minutes until it stopped being tacky, and then assemble and press 2 parts together. For what appears to be the page on the sides of the book, I took a piece of pine and then start to score it with a Stanley knife and keep going with a wood knife. I've primed it with a white gesso, then done a dirty wash with a brown acrylic paint diluted, and then done some dry brushing with white for the highlights. I've glued some brick texture on the inside and then use a hot glue gun to connect it to the main book. Now I'm going to talk about the cobblestone. Looking back, I should have used a similar technique than the brick, using some EVA foam, but I thought, okay, it took me ages to do the brick, let's find a shortcut. So an alternative will be to do a small sample with polymer clay, and then you pour some silicone over it to make a negative that becomes a stamp, and then you apply the stamp multiple times. That will have been the right thing to do, but I wanted a shortcut, so instead of creating a positive in polymer clay, I created a negative and wanted to use it directly as a stamp. This is how it looks before I cook it for 10 minutes. I apply thick layers of flexible modeling paste, Liquid X in that case, on my board and then use my polymer stamp. It worked okay-ish at the beginning, but it started to fall apart and crumble because it's not flexible as silicone. It didn't work well for too long and I ended up spending hours fixing it by hand. Then let it dry overnight and prime it, and then start laying lots and lots of different colors until I was happy with it, and then cover the whole thing with a diluted brownish gray and remove the excess with a wet paper towel. Then I dry brush it with a light gray for the highlights and seal it with a clean matte varnish. Now I'm going to talk about the workbench and other furniture. To make this workbench, first I made a rough mock-up in cardboard to give me a good idea of the right dimension for it. Then I took an old ruler that I found in salvage yards and put it apart. Use a saw to cut it to size. I've used a bit of cardboard covering with a hot glue gun and then apply every bit onto it. I've also applied a bit at the front, back and on the side to cover all the cardboard. Then with the leftover make some feet, glue them to the table and add some bits on the side to make sure it's stable. Now I wanted to create a vise at the front of the bench, so I've used some leftover of the ruler and drill some holes. Then I've used some Japanese screws because they're already black and they look really lovely. I had to file down the central screw so I have enough space to fit a piece of black wire. Then I've dirtied down everything by applying some acrylic paint and cover the piece of glue and age it much more. Then I've added a little bit of puff paint on each side. For the shelves, I had some other rulers that I took apart and cut to size, and then I hot glue some piece of pine onto it. And then I've applied some diluted brown paint as usual with everything else and remove the excess to age the pine. Now for the chest of drawers. First, I've used a sheet of balsa wood and I've damaged it with a screwdriver to create some dent into it. Then I marked up where I wanted my drawers to be. I actually didn't cut and make all the drawers, but I wanted to create the illusion that all the drawers existed. So I just selected 4 of them, cut them out and remove the wood inside of those 4 rectangles. Then I marked up and aged the front of this block of wood to age it further. I've cut some pieces of balsa wood to create tiny little drawers, and then I glued them inside of the chest of drawers. Then I've used some wood glue and stick all my other drawers on the front. So this is how it looks before paint. You have the illusion that all the drawers are functional when actually only 4 of them works. I've then applied some diluted brown paint throughout. Then I dry brush it with some beige color to highlight all the texture. For the handles, I've used a little bit of puff paint. Now let's make some tiny tools. I've used my own saw and tools for references and used bits of wood that I had left over from other projects. So I've tried to copy the handles of my saw and use an X-Acto blade to start shaping it. Separate the handle from what is supposed to be the blade at the end of it, because you want to have something to grab on for as long as you can to be able to do the job and avoid having the blades ending up on your fingers. Sand it down. Then I've used some plastic from packaging and mark up some blades and cut 3 of them to match my handles. I wanted to make a series of Japanese saws. I really like their designs, so I've cut a little piece of wood to match it at the scale of 1/10, sand it down and start pressing the knife throughout to create the texture. I've also cut some blades out of packaging plastic to match each of the handle. For the mallets, I've used some little wood stick and started shaping it and cut it to size. Initially I cut it straight, and then I started using my knife at an angle to shape the wood further. For the hammers, I've used some leftover bits of wood, and same as previously, I start slowly shaping the piece to look like my original hammer. For the wrenches, I could have used polymer clay, but I decided to keep going with wood, in that case pine, and use a little Dremel to go into every little details. Then I glue the handles to each mallet, hammer, and same for the saw and their blades. Then I've painted it. And the very important part is to age every single one of them. So apply some diluted paint, remove the excess, and you're going to see a huge difference. It makes it much more realistic. Now for the tiny little screwdrivers, I've took my drill upside down and clamped it into a vise and inserted a tiny piece of wood into the drill. Then I use some tiny little files and start shaping the wood. I made lots of them, different size, different shape. Then I made a hole and super glue some wire into it. I've applied some diluted brown paint to color the handle. And then I've cut the wire to size and shape it. It's quite nice if you have a diversity of shapes and colors for your screwdrivers. I follow the same kind of system with some wood and wire to create some clamps and add a little bit of puff paint for details. Then I'll start to assemble everything by hot gluing the chest of drawers to the wall. I've hot glued the workbench to the brick wall as well, and this is how it looks at the start. Then I kept gluing stuff onto it, bits of copper, leftover of plumbing materials, all sorts of things, and you start to fill up the shelf to create the effect of a workshop, which is always packed with stuff. Now I'm going to talk about the Victorian bandsaw. I took inspiration from actual Victorian bandsaw and create a drawings out of it. I've copied that pattern onto a piece of oak and cut it with a jigsaw. I've used my Dremel for sanding down all the edges. If you have one of those Dremel bits that looks like a ball, it creates some really nice detail onto the oak. Then I've used lots of little gears that I found in the model shop and start to place them to see how I'm gonna make this whole thing work. How they're gonna connect together, the placement, how I'm gonna have a top components spinning around that actually activate the rest and connect with the Victorian bandsaw. My gears were looking really modern and plasticky, so I've decided to cover them with a piece of Worbla. It's a thermoplastic that is just amazing. You warm it up with a heat gun and apply it and shape it onto the gear. Now you can see I've added a piece of the front and the back, and that created a channel that was perfect for my blades to slide into later on. So I've started to assemble the pieces. The back gear was tightly fitted with the front gear because I needed to make sure that once the back gear was activated, it will move the front one accordingly. The lower gear was loose for the moment. I've used a piece of string to measure the size of the blade that I need to cut. Then I've used that string on a piece of clear Worbla to define the length and cut a really thin strip out of it. I've tested the size onto the bandsaw, make sure it fits right, and then I start to cut a little dent with a scissor. I've stick the end together with super glue and cover with silver paint. Then I test everything on. I needed to stretch it enough so there's the tension, that means the top gear will activate the bottom gear, but it was a bit of a struggle, and honestly I had to do this piece 3 times just because it keeps snapping out. And the super glue didn't hold it enough because it's so damn thin. It was really hard to get it right. So this is a little box I've created. You have a base plate that is connected to the main wall. Then I've used some spacer, in that case lollipop sticks, and then I've got a plate where the mechanic is gonna slide into. So I've applied some wood glue onto my base, then added the spacer. Then added the middle plate where the sliders is going to go into. I cut a piece out of an aluminium sheets and file it to shape. Then I've assembled all my pieces. As you can see, this is how it looks, and it needs to slide very easily. So I kept adjusting it, cutting bits out, sanding it down until it moves smoothly. Then I start to place it next to the gear. Then I start piling up all the little washer I had in my workshop to start to create a system that works and that can spin smoothly. I then screw my gears up to the wall and test it out. It took quite a few adjustments to get it right. Then I've added my top box and make sure the gear can still spin without being stopped or blocked by the top box. As usual with everything steampunk, you need to dirty down everything. I've used some black gesso, so it's a primer, it holds better to the metal. Then I've started to add all my components, all the other gear. I've added some block of wood that I've painted. I've also printed some tiny steampunk board that I'm gonna glue to the wood block. For some of the gears, I've actually super glued the nuts at the end of a thick wire, then super glue the gear onto it, and then super glue another spacer to sandwich everything together and make sure that holds. Once that was set, I was able to drill my wall and pass the wire through. That way I can go at the back of the board. That allows me to activate the gears from behind the set. I've done another one as well because I wanted to make sure to have a plan B. If one of them is starting to get loose or doesn't work properly, I wanted to make sure to have two of them working. And that was actually a really safe plan because one of them ended up not working properly, so I had the other one. Then I've placed my pencil onto it and it took quite a few adjustments to get it right and to function all together. Now for the wood burner, I've used a plastic bottle, cut the bottom of it, later in I had to stick it back on, but that's how you learn. I've used a piece of warbler that I warm up with a heat gun and apply and shape onto the bottle. I kept adding more piece of warbler to start creating a nice detail onto the piece. And then I hot glue it onto my board. Make sure it can move easily. Then I've dry brushed it with some silver paint to give it a really quick metal effect and add some puff paint for detail. To create the fire effect, I use a scoop, the kind that you have in protein shake, and some clear warbler that I've heated and shaped around this scoop. I've added few layers of warbler to build up. Then I hot glue the warbler to the scoop to make sure it holds. And then I start painting it. I didn't have warm LED light to get into it, only cold, but if you have warm light, you're halfway there. Then I keep adding orange and red. It looks a bit too red by the end of it, but it ended up working. Once everything was dry, I slide some LEDs onto the little scoop and then place it into the burner. By only twisting the handles, I can change the way the fire was looking from the front. So when I was doing stop motion, I would turn it around, take a picture, then change the scoop direction and take another picture. Now I'm gonna show you how I made the little lantern. I first made a mock-up out of balsa wood, then use a piece of paper to guess the size of warbler I will need to cover it. I've used that piece of paper as a template and copied 3 times on the warbler for the 3 lanterns I wanted to create. Then I warm up the warbler and press into the shape. The brilliant stuff about this material is that if you don't succeed the first time, it's fine. You reheat, reshape it, you add more material because it sticks to itself, cut the excess, reuse it somewhere else. And then cut some openings on each side of the lantern. Then you have to press it out, and if it tears, don't worry, warm it up, stick it back in together. So this is how it looks. Then I heated a little piece of clear Worbla and shape it around my base, hold it together a little bit while it's cooling down and taking the shape, and then stick into my lantern. I've used a little bit of hot glue to make sure it holds in place, and I've also added a little bit of wood at the top so I have something to work with when I want to stick it onto my wall. I dry brush it with a little bit of silver paint to create a metal effect. And then I've added a little bit of detail by adding a copper ring, a tiny piece of chain, and a little bit of copper wire that I've shaped. Then I drill my boards, quite large, and stick my lantern onto it. From behind, I was able to stick as many micro LED as I could and tape it in place and test it out to see if it works. You can also add some nice detail with some puff paint. And then just add as much detail as you can. Add some bit of Worbla, add some puff paint, some old wire, some bits of wood that you cover with some prints of steampunk boards. As much detail as you can so it appears like a realistic workshop, which is always packed with stuff. Now I'm going to talk about the book cover. Now if you have some ornaments, you can pour some silicone over and create a mold. I had some molds that I've done a few years back made out of cornstarch and industrial silicone. It's not as detailed as proper silicone for molding, but it costs a fraction of the price and it works. So if you're interested, Google it, cornstarch and industrial silicone. I've mixed up some 2-part fast cast resin together and pour it into the molds. 20 minutes or so later I was able to take it out. It's not completely set, but it's a bit flexible, which makes it handy to take out. And I've sanded down the edges and make sure it's sit flush. Then I've primed it with white gesso, paint it with copper acrylic paint, and then dry brush it with some gold acrylic for the highlight. Now for the octopus, I've done a rough mock-up in aluminium foil to see the proportion, and then I cover everything with polymer clay, super sculpey in that case. Then I start to shape every tentacle, start to create a nice smooth surface. Added some volume for the head. Then I went back and forth, making sure the curve and the shape was right, and kept sculpting it. For the suction pad, I've made little balls of different sizes and pressed them onto the tentacles, one by one, and you repeat hundreds of times. Add as much texture as you can by adding small bits of clay or use some little tools to add textures. Cook it for half an hour at low temperature and then start painting it. Now for the lettering, I've printed the text I want with a Victorian font and I've covered it with a baking paper. Then I've used some puff paint and cover every single letter. Let that dry overnight. I've cut some 5mm foam board for the base and used some fake leather to cover it. I've cut the fake leather a bit bigger than my board and applied lots of PVA onto it. Then I've pressed my board onto the PVA and add some books to add pressure to it. I've used a hot glue gun to be able to fold back the edges. Then I've hot glued all the ornaments onto my cover. I took the template for the text and cut out all the letters. Then I've taped it to my book cover and that was really handy to be able to place all the letters one by one with some super glue. I've also added a really cool handle that I found in Savage Yards. Then an important step is to dirty down everything. Apply some diluted brown acrylic paint throughout and remove the excess with some paper towel. I've done quite a few of those washes with different shades of brown or black. I've done the same with every ornament. I've then hot glued my octopus onto the board and did some dirty wash all around it as well. Then I've let the hot glue gun warm up until it was boiling hot, and then I had lots of glue to work with so I can glue my cover to the board. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you're making your own set, be patient. It's a labor of love. It takes time. Next time, I'm going to show you how I made the steampunk puppet from scratch. See you next time. Take care.